There is a parchment in the Vatican the size of a dining room table. It was written in August 1308. For 693 years, nobody knew it existed. Then, one afternoon in September 2001, a 31-year-old Italian archivist reached into the wrong box and rewrote everything we thought we knew about why the Knights Templar died. That single document changes the story entirely, not as a theory, as a fact, as a piece of vellum with a reference number. Archivum Archis Armarium D217. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want to know your answer. When an institution holds 53 miles of documents, restricts what scholars can see, and classifies everything after 1958, do you think silence is protection or concealment? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, your answer might be different from what it is right now. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I did not come to this topic looking for scandal. I was researching medieval ecclesiastical law, genuinely dry stuff, and I kept hitting the same wall. Documents that should have existed didn't. Documents that did exist had been misfiled for centuries, and every time I followed one of those threads, it led me back to the same address, Vatican City, the same archive, 53 miles of shelving, 2 floors underground, in a fireproof concrete bunker that most of the world will never enter. Here is what we know with certainty. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, a name changed by Pope Francis only in 2019, is the central repository of everything the Holy See has ever produced, received, or decided to keep. It holds 85 kilometers of shelving, 35,000 volumes in the selective catalog alone, documents stretching back to the papacy of Pope John VIII in the 9th century, letters from Henry VIII begging for an annulment, a handwritten transcript of the trial of Galileo, a letter from Michelangelo complaining he hadn't been paid for the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo wrote a complaint letter. That letter still exists. The archive was closed to all outsiders, completely sealed, until 1881, when Pope Leo XIII opened it under pressure. Not ideological pressure, political pressure. The newly unified Italian state had just established its own state archive in Rome, and the Vatican's holdings were embarrassingly thin by comparison. Open the archives or watch them be absorbed into the secular state. Leo XIII chose to open them, but only partially, only to credentialed scholars, only to certain time periods. And even today, more than 140 years after that decision, everything dated after 1958 remains classified, actively denied to researchers, not merely restricted. I need you to hold on to that year, 1958. We will come back to it. Now, let me tell you about a woman named Barbara Fraile. In September 2001, Fraile was 31 years old and working as a paleographer at the Vatican Secret Archives. She had spent years specializing in medieval documents, earning her credentials in paleography, diplomatics, and archival science at the Vatican's own school. She was not looking for lost history. She was cataloging trial documents, standard archival work. She reached into a box of misfiled papers from the early 14th century, and she found it. A parchment dated August 17th through 20th, 1308, written at Chinon Castle in France, signed by 3 papal cardinals as representatives of Pope Clement V, addressed to the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay. The document's reference number is D217. Its contents are not ambiguous. Pope Clement V, the head of the Catholic Church, had secretly absolved the leadership of the Knights Templar of all charges of heresy. Here is why that matters. For 7 centuries, history told us this: the Knights Templar were a powerful Catholic military order founded during the Crusades. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, who was deeply in debt to the Templars and needed their wealth, accused them of heresy, sodomy, and worshipping false idols. The Inquisition tortured them into confessions. Pope Clement V condemned them, and in 1314, Jacques de Molay was burned alive at the stake in Paris. End of story. That is the version in textbooks. And it is not wrong, it just stops too early. What the Chinon parchment proves is that between the arrest in 1307 and the execution in 1314, something happened that history forgot. In 1308, Pope Clement V sent 3 cardinals to Chinon Castle to investigate the charges personally. They heard confessions. They reviewed the evidence, and they issued a formal absolution. The Templar leaders, including de Molay, were cleared of heresy by the Pope's own representatives. The Pope knew. He knew they were innocent of the central charge. He knew it in writing, with his cardinal seals on the document, 6 years before he allowed Philip IV to execute them. Now, the popular conspiracy version of this story goes like this. The Church secretly supported Philip. The Templars had dangerous secret knowledge. The execution was a coordinated cover-up. I spent several weeks with the actual historical record on this. That version collapses under scrutiny, and what replaces it is, if anything, worse, because the reality documented in D217 is not conspiracy. It is something more unsettling than conspiracy. It is cowardice in ink. The Chinon parchment makes clear that Clement V was attempting to save the Templars, quietly. His plan was to absolve them privately, demonstrate they were not heretics, and then dissolve the order in an orderly fashion that would neutralize Philip's crusade against them. But Philip IV would not stop. He threatened military force. He had already pressured Clement to move the papacy itself from Rome to Avignon, where Clement was, effectively, a political dependent of the French crown. And so the Pope made a calculation. He had the document. He had the absolution. He kept it in the archive. And he let Jacques de Molay burn. De Molay was approximately 70 years old when they lit the fire. He had reportedly been tortured repeatedly over 7 years. According to contemporary accounts, he recanted his confession publicly from the flames, declaring the order innocent. He died in 1314. The document proving his innocence sat in a Vatican box, misfiled, for another 687 years. That is not conspiracy. That is a documented sequence of events. Each step had a plausible justification. Taken together, they describe a pattern: institutional self-preservation over individual human life. Because here is what I keep coming back to. The Chinon parchment was not hidden, it was misfiled. That is either an extraordinary archival accident in the most carefully managed private archive in Western history. The Vatican has never issued a formal explanation for how a document of that historical significance, the official record of a papal inquiry, ended up in the wrong box for 7 centuries. Archives don't misfile things without reason. Now I want to tell you about a night in October 1943, because the same archive that held the Chinon parchment also held something far more recent and far more damaging. On October 16, 1943, at dawn, SS officers went door to door through the Jewish neighborhood of Rome. They had lists. Within hours, 1,260 Jewish men, women, and children had been arrested and brought to a military college. They were held there for 2 full days. The military college was 800 yards from St. Peter's Square. The Pope could, in principle, have seen the building from Vatican grounds. On October 18th, 1,007 of those people were loaded onto trains and taken to Auschwitz. 16 survived. The Vatican's archives on Pope Pius XII were sealed from researchers for decades. Pope Francis finally opened them in March 2020. Historian David Kurtzer of Brown University, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, was among the first scholars to enter. What he found, documented in his book The Pope at War, drawn directly from newly unsealed files, is this. The Pope received detailed reports on the genocide of European Jews beginning in the fall of 1942. A Vatican diplomat wrote urging the Pope to make even a private oral protest to the German ambassador. Pius asked for advice from his expert on Jewish affairs, a Monsignor named Angelo Dell'Acqua. Dell'Acqua's written response, still in the archive, advised against any protest at all. The language in that memo, according to Kurtzer, was, in his words, thoroughly anti-Semitic in its reasoning. The Pope said nothing publicly, not during the roundup, not during the deportation, not after the war. The Vatican's position, as revealed by internal documents, was to intervene only on behalf of Jews who had been baptized as Catholics. Of the 1,260 arrested in Rome that October morning, approximately 250 were freed before the trains left, the ones who could prove Catholic baptism. The other 1,007 were not the Vatican's concern. I want to be precise here, because this is where most people telling this story get it wrong. The simple narrative, the Pope was Hitler's Pope, a silent accomplice, a coward, was the version pushed by a 1963 German play, and it became a weapon. The Vatican has long countered it with documentation of quiet interventions, diplomatic backchannels, and Jewish lives saved through informal networks. Both accounts are true, and both accounts are incomplete. Kurtzer himself is clear. Pius XII was not indifferent, he was afraid. He was calculating the institutional survival of the Church in a Europe he feared Hitler would win. He was making what he considered a rational decision, and the archive proves that he made it consciously. It is a documented decision-making process, preserved in the archive, classified for 62 years. Here is the pattern, compressed. In 1308, a pope absolved the Knights Templar of heresy in a private document, then allowed a politically motivated king to execute their leader. The document was filed and forgotten. In 1633, the Vatican forced Galileo Galilei to kneel and publicly curse the scientific truth that the earth revolves around the sun. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The full transcripts of his trial sat in the archive. The Church took 359 years to formally apologize. In 1992. In 1789, Napoleon invaded Italy and ordered the Vatican archives transferred to Paris. An archivist, unnamed in the records, assisted in the transfer. Thousands of documents were moved. When they were eventually returned in 1817, several thousand had been lost, discarded to save transportation costs. No one knows precisely which documents were destroyed. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII opened the archive to scholars, under duress, not by choice. The 75-year rule was established, meaning researchers could access records only 75 years after the close of a papacy. In 1939, the future Pius XII signed the Reichskonkordat's political aftermath, documents showing him calculating the survival of the Church under a fascist Europe he expected to last. In 1942, the Vatican received eyewitness reports of mass murder in Poland. The records of those reports are now in the archive. In 1943, 1,007 Jews were deported from 800 yards away. The internal deliberations about that event are now in the archive. In 2001, a 31-year-old archivist reached into the wrong box and found 693 years of silence on a piece of vellum. In 2019, the Vatican quietly renamed the secret archive, not because the contents changed, because the name had become a liability. In 2020, the Pius XII archive was finally opened, only after the last of his advisors had died and 62 years after his own death. Everything after 1958 remains classified. Let me circle back to where we started, to Barbara Frail, to the parchment in the wrong box. When the Chinon parchment was published in a limited edition by the Vatican in 2007, they printed exactly 799 numbered copies for public sale. They printed one unnumbered copy. That one was reserved for Pope Benedict XVI. The Pope received a copy of the document, proving his institution had known about an innocent man's execution for 7 centuries and kept the knowledge in a box. I don't know what the post-1958 classified section contains. Nobody outside a very small group of people does. The Vatican says it contains sensitive material about living individuals and ongoing diplomatic relationships. That is a reasonable explanation. Most archives have similar restrictions. But here is what I keep returning to. The cutoff is not arbitrary. 1958 is the year Pius XII died. The man whose wartime conduct is the single most debated question in 20th century Catholic history died in 1958. His entire papacy is now open to researchers. But whatever came after him, the institutional response to his legacy, the decisions made by those who knew what he had known, that remains sealed. Archives don't forget. They just decide what gets filed where. And here is the question I cannot answer, and that I think you should sit with. If the documents from 1308 proved an innocent man had been allowed to die, and were lost for 700 years in the wrong box, what are the odds that the documents from 1958 onward are simply waiting for another Barbara Frail? And what are the odds that they aren't? If this kind of documentary history is what you come here for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes through the same process. Research first, archive second, conclusions only when the evidence earns them. Hit the subscribe button and you will not miss what comes next. Because this is not the last time we will find ourselves standing outside a locked archive, asking what is inside. The parchment is still there, reference number D217, in a bunker under Vatican City, waiting for the next wrong box.